here's Brody Brazil.
I'm going to start this video with something that is both sad and true. Look, I'm 43 years old, and I know the demographics of this YouTube channel. Most of you are younger than me watching this, but some of you are significantly younger than me watching this. Like, you might be 23 years old, so you really don't have a grasp of what ESPN used to be like. And I'm not talking about in its earliest days, but I am referring to the late 80s, the early 90s, the mid 90s, even the late 90s. ESPN was something so different back in the day. And I say that in a sense that I feel like people really loved ESPN. They had a connection to ESPN 25, 30 years ago that maybe they don't as much have that here in 2024. And so I'll explain ESPN then versus now, what has changed. Again, I'm not trying to be the old stubborn man here, but let me first start off with why I'm biting on this. Why am I even wanting to talk about this? Isn't this kind of weird of me talking about like my own industry? Well, yes and no. I'm somebody who watched a lot of 1990s ESPN programming, from Baseball Tonight and SportsCenter and Outside the Lines and the Sports Reporters, all those different shows. I've also been working in this business, not for or with ESPN for the last 25 years, but in tandem with them. I've been watching them. I know people that work for them, have worked for them. I understand what they're doing publicly and also behind the scenes. I've also seen how the sports media landscape has totally changed. Like, if ESPN was still doing the same thing from the 80s and 90s, they'd be out of business right now. You have to evolve, otherwise you get yourself in trouble. But I'm also here to tell you some things they've done make sense. They had to do them, or it was in their best interest. Other things they've done, it's kind of unfortunate, and that's why I'm saying I don't know that people of this generation growing up right now will ever appreciate ESPN like I did when I was coming up. Here's my kind of list of biggest changes. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, in no particular order here. Number 1 is the SportsCenter versus talk show eras. SportsCenter era was definitely the 80s into the 90s, maybe some of the 2000s, but somewhere in the 2000s, definitely into the 2010s, we got into this talk show era. The morning programs, the debates, it's kind of formulaic television, which I'll get into in just a second. So how the evolution of the primary show used to be SportsCenter. SportsCenter is not the primary flagship show. They might still call it that, but all of the other talk and debate shows, those are the flagship of ESPN right now. Outside the Lines, whatever happened to that show? Baseball Tonight, why did that go away in 2019, even though ESPN still carries a large national baseball contract? NFL programming, it's always been there. It has spiked in the last 15 years. And then staple personalities. I think the lack of staple personalities, that has totally changed with ESPN across the last several decades. Da-na-na, da-na-na. I mean, how can you not do that when you look at Chris Berman and Linda Cohn and all the greats there, Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann and everybody that was part of SportsCenter back in the day, Stuart Scott. Some legends right there, and that set and that font, just so classic. And that was probably the later years of me remembering SportsCenter, but it's just iconic to look at there. SportsCenter was the default way for people to keep tabs on sports. Remember, there was no social media and scrolling, and the way to watch it was to turn on the television and wait till it came on. SportsCenter would repeat every 30 to 60 minutes, and you got to watch your team and how the story of their night, day or night, played out when they were covered. SportsCenter obviously largely replaced by social media in the last 15 to 20 years, but that show had personality, largely based on the two anchors that were hosting on that given day or night. And their catchphrases and the way they delivered things, and were they serious or were they snarky or were they this or that? Personality is why a lot of people felt comfortable and came back to SportsCenter, because they wanted that personality with their highlights. That's why people to this day, when they read a highlight, they fit in some of the old SportsCenter slogans of the typical sports anchor. They were a model of storytelling. It wasn't just Jordan hits the jumper, Bulls up by 4. Going the other way, David Robinson finishes the alley-oop, the Spurs bring it within 3. That's not it. There was so much storytelling of the games and the series and the seasons and the highlights. They did such a good job of that as part of the narrative. It was almost like a soap opera, watching a real-life soap opera. And again, familiar faces, and the show was on at similar times. And today, it's no offense to anybody that works on SportsCenter, it's just not the same. And it may never be the same, like on television at least. It just might not. So SportsCenter alone is probably the biggest change, as opposed to now the talk show era. It's formulaic programming. Okay, put a moderator between two guests on this side, two guests on that side, bring up the 5 topics of the day, let everybody argue, let everybody make their viral points. These shows, they mix information, they mix some opinion, and maybe they mix it too much. A lot of people still feel like they're watching SportsCenter, they're watching news and information, when in reality, a lot of this stuff is Stephen A. Smith's opinion. Nothing wrong with that, but let's be clear, he's not like a reporter. He's an opinionator, right? And that's fine. But most people don't understand where he's coming from. It's more about what gets said on those programs, First Take, PTI, all that stuff, and how much of it can go viral. Did I misspell that? Let me fix that right now. There we go. It's about more stuff going viral and capturing viewer emotions, right? It's trying to tug at your heartstrings. And maybe SportsCenter never really did the greatest job of that. It was just covering the stuff that was happening. In this case, like ESPN is almost inventing the content, inventing the programming. And hot takes in this case are always a win. It feels like, even when the takes themselves may not be wins, and you don't like what the person is saying, or you don't agree with this take or that take. But it got you thinking, and it got you talking, and it got you watching, most importantly. And the high profiles are still here, like your favorite SportsCenter anchors are now the aforementioned Stephen A. Smith or Pat McAfee, who has jumped into an interesting space, and on and on and on. So the talk show era has basically taken over what SportsCenter used to be as the cornerstone. And then there was a show like Outside the Lines. Bob Lee did this show for multiple decades. He was one of the ESPN originals. He was a true journalist. It was this show, Outside the Lines, and Real Sports, which was just on HBO. In fact, that show recently came to an end. Outside the Lines officially as a daily show came to an end a handful of years ago. But those two shows were the true model of sports broadcast journalism. They went out and covered stories. They dug deep into scandals and controversies and social issues and racial issues and political issues. But they dug so deep sometimes into their own business partners, you'd have to think somewhere along the line, an executive at ESPN said, look, this is a good show. It's quality journalism, but it gets us in trouble with our business partners, and maybe we can't do this anymore. And maybe that's the reason why it's gone. Or there's less of an appetite. I don't know. I think this show covered important topics, but it's not around anymore. It was an important staple of sports television, and it's not on ESPN anymore. And I think they would be successful. There is room, and there is content, and there is material for Outside the Lines. They just don't do it. They also don't do Baseball Tonight anymore. They stopped doing that show in 2019. And it's hard to imagine like the staple cast members of the show, Peter Gammons, Carl Ravitch, Harold Reynolds, and others. I could hear the theme song in my head right now. Or when somebody hit the home runs, they'd show all the home runs, the screaming baseball, which would then lead to like 3 Albert Bell dingers in 1994 or whatever. But point being is that Baseball Tonight, it's hard to believe that a show with highlights and insights and interviews 7 days a week got canceled as a daily show in 2019. That show, because it was on ESPN every night, gave baseball and its players a huge platform. Kind of what baseball doesn't have and needs a little bit more of these days. The names and faces every single day and night on ESPN. I don't know how this show ended for them. They still carry a lot of Major League Baseball games. Is it because they don't have enough room with all the talk and football programming? Possibly. I mean, there are year-round football shows. I don't think they did Baseball Tonight year-round, but season-long they did, every season, and then they stopped. And I understand MLB Network, they've tried to take the place of that show, MLB Tonight, and the NHL has a show based on hockey games, but that's a league production. And no offense to MLB Network, NHL Network, the way that ESPN did it before, it's hard for anybody to replicate what they had been doing and the crew that they garnered and the cast that they had. So Baseball Tonight's non-existence, it's hard for me to understand. NFL programming has always been there, but I also want you to understand it's a part of the contract that ESPN signs with the NFL. We're not only going to cover your games and pay you a lot of money to do that, we're also going to, as part of our value in this deal, do a certain amount of hours per week of NFL programming during our daytime hours. So the NFL programming has strategically, because of ratings, but also because of business agreements, gone way, way up. It's multiplied several times over since the 1990s. I do an interesting game sometimes, and I do this with sports radio. I do it with sports networks. Turn on the TV. I play football roulette, and I'll do this in the months of June, July, before training camp and preseason in August. But actually, you know what, even earlier, April, May, June, July. When football, maybe with the exception of the draft, it really shouldn't be a centerpiece of the conversation. Turn on the TV. Are they talking about football? Oh, yes, they are. ESPN is always like that. Football year-round. And that's fine. I'm just saying in the course of everything else they do, is this better or worse that ESPN is stuck on this programming versus being a little bit more versatile during the off months of the NFL season? Does the NFL coverage and programming overshadow some of their other sports or properties? It's possible, but it doesn't matter. They're tied into doing this. So even if they wanted to change, they may not necessarily do so. And last but not least here, I find this close to my heart, the staple personalities. ESPN started randomizing their hosts and anchors on SportsCenter in the early 2000s, and coincidentally, that was kind of the demise of that particular program. That and technology and culture and all that stuff. But the point is that when you went away from the familiar faces and you broke up the band, so to speak, I mean, personality is what people came back to. That's what the viewers got comfortable with. And maybe ESPN didn't want to make their big faces get paid too big, and they didn't want to make them superstars because then it's hard to replace and take care of. But imagine ESPN. Remember that picture I just showed you of the whole entire crew there from back in the day? Most of them are still working as broadcasters. So we're not to the point where they've all retired, or unfortunately, in the case of Stuart Scott, rest in peace, has passed away. Most of them are still around doing their thing. But imagine if ESPN had kept most of their originals. Would SportsCenter and ESPN's popularity still exist like it used to? I think it would. I think the lack of their personalities kind of started the turning point of really a then versus now. Programming's different, approach is different, but personality is way different than they ever used to be. So, again, just a little look at ESPN. I saw some other people talking about this the other day. I thought it was interesting enough to discuss here, make a video about. Tell me what you think. Did I hit this right? Am I missing some things? What do you want to add? Put it down there in the comment section below. Also go down there. Give me a thumbs up if you would. That'll help me, this video, and this channel. And by the way, if you don't subscribe yet, go ahead right now. Please do. That would make me so happy. Most importantly, because it means I get to see you next time.